Welcome to the Living Springs Q&A podcast, where your questions are answered live every week by the pastors of Living Springs. Thanks for tuning in.
Good day, everyone. Welcome to our Q&A podcast. We are back with three people sitting here. Doug's home from holidays.
I am.
Looking refreshed and ready to go. So,
And I,
close to you, Blake.
as we just said, I didn't listen to the podcast while I was on holidays, so I have no idea what sort of heresy was said. But here to at least get things back on
Still a
track.
balance to the force.
So, yeah.
right on.
But we're here. I see that you guys did tackle some pretty big issues.
They were.
In some of the questions while I was away.
Yeah.
And we do have some feedback on those.
Yeah.
Yes, we have some AER. So,
Time for accusations, explanations, and recantations.
It worked.
there we go.
That's awesome. We are official again.
We were just saying that the first time we did AER was when Doug was on holidays the last time.
It had a plethora of notes that he
I
wanted
don't
to
believe it was
respond
when
to.
I was on holidays. It was when I got back from being on holidays.
Yes.
Yeah,
That-
like you
that-
came back having had watched us.
I wasn't on holidays. It was when I had COVID.
Oh,
because
that's
I
what
was
it
listening to the podcast.
Sitting at
Because
home.
when I go on holidays, I don't listen to the
Right.
podcast.
Yes.
But I was at home going, oh,
Screaming at the air, saying, "Why are they saying that?"
and why are they not saying this?
Totally.
And so, yes, you're right. That was when it was.
There you go.
But these AERs are not from Doug, so
No.
we will read away here. It says, on the abortion issue, I volunteered for a pro-life group that was focused on helping the woman through the process on having the baby with all its needs. We never encouraged the woman either way, but offered help if they chose to keep it. So 2 points. We found it was usually someone else, either the parents, husband, boyfriend, etc., who insisted on the abortion. And the second point is, sometimes it is okay to be arm's length from our identity as Christians in order to make it more comfortable for prospects to approach us.
To the second point that they make, that is sad but true. Laura Lee and I have actually said over the last couple of years on more than one occasion, maybe we need to find a new term because the term Christian has a lot of baggage.
Yeah.
Just like the term evangelical has a lot of baggage, that people have this idea of what it means that I go, that's not who I am.
Yeah.
So
Which we addressed last week.
I appreciate this person saying that.
Yeah. Oh, totally. I was listening to a podcast on the Jesus Collective, and they were doing one actually interviewing two staff from a church in Lethbridge, of all places. And he
Of all places,
Well,
like
it's
that
interesting.
horrible place. What good could come out of Lethbridge?
It's an international podcast, and they picked one in southern Alberta.
Of all places.
I thought it was cool.
Could you imagine? Somebody wanted to talk to someone in Lethbridge.
I thought it was really cool that we got to hear
Did
an
you miss me?
Albertan church doing some really cool things. Oh, so much. The one pastor said something that I found really interesting. He was talking about how the church now, as a result of all the negative views that so much of culture in Canada has towards the church, we have to become the church that we were intended to be in acting like Christ and providing care, not just to make an impact, but to get back to net zero kind of
Yes.
thing, which is a really interesting statement. And so, yeah, that struck me as I read or heard you read the second comment there.
I can remember years ago discovering that when you tell people you're a pastor, they react really weird.
Yes.
And so I never wanted to let people know what I did for a living until they got to know me a little bit.
Yep.
And I can remember at one point somebody got to know me. And then after a certain course of time, they said, what do you do for a living?
Yeah.
And I said, I'm a pastor. And they're like, wow, you seem so normal. And I was like, well, I try to be.
Yeah.
But it's sad that that's now the perception over the whole church.
Oh, yeah.
It is really unfortunate. And I can't speak to their first point where they say they found it was usually someone. I have no idea. I was there. Appreciate them sharing their perspective on that. But for the second one, that just saddens me.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we need to work pretty hard to rebuild that identity.
Yeah.
I would like to see that.
Yeah.
All right. I think this is from the same person, has another point.
Yeah.
Their other point is, they said this wasn't discussed, but this is not just about the woman. A society either acknowledges a child's right to live or not. One thing I respect about Morgenthaler is that he is consistent. He believes in both abortion and infanticide. I believe in neither, but understand that they are the same thing. Those who are pro-abortion need to come to terms with that.
And on the flip side, and Keelan and I were talking about this, that you guys did address this last week, people who are pro-life need to be pro-life, not pro-birth.
Yes.
And that there is definitely an issue and an inconsistency there where you say you can't have an abortion, that is a human being and they have rights and they deserve to live, but as soon as they're born, I don't want to help them and I don't want anything to do with them.
Yeah. Well, just because we were talking mostly U.S. context last week when we addressed
I'm
these.
speaking in the U.S. context.
Yeah, and looking at that, it was last week where the Republicans voted against the bill to pass to give some financial support to help solve the formula crisis. It's like at the same week that they're striking down Roe v. Wade, they're also saying, and there's no way we're going to help give federal money to help feed the babies that we're now forcing you to have, kind of thing. It was just this interesting dichotomy the same week.
So how far down this rabbit trail do we want to get? I look at it and I think when you're looking in the American context, you see there's the Democrats and the Republicans, and they each have their own positions on everything. And in the Republican Party, the conflict between some of their own positions is staggering to me. And you look at the tragic shooting that took place in Texas yesterday. That a bunch of children were killed again. And I looked at some of the pastors from the states that I follow on Instagram and their posts, and they're heartbreaking. And I don't know if you guys saw Steve Kerr, who's the coach of the Golden State Warriors, crying during his news conference, talking about, I'm not talking about basketball, like we need to talk about this and something needs to be done. And yet at the same time, these people who are like, we're pro-life, refuse to even do anything to have any sort of gun control. And I realize I'm not American.
Yep.
Absolutely. But I look at it, I'm like, again, this goes back to, if you're pro-life, you have to be pro-life for all of life.
Totally.
And you can't. We were driving home, and we were going through Idaho, and there was this, I think it was just this guy put it on the edge of his driveway. It was like a driveway going up, and it's like, you're in Trump country. God, guns, and then there's two other things. And I was like, those are the first two things. God and guns. That's just, it's weird. And I'm not saying you can't have a gun.
Yeah.
But we have to recognize the tension between those two.
Yeah.
And that American political dichotomy and those American political extremes are coming into Canada.
Yeah.
And they're coming into the church, more so, I think, than in culture. I think that it's not that the American Democrats are influencing in a great way liberals in Canada, but the American conservative republicanism is bleeding its way into the Canadian church, and I think taking us in the wrong direction in the church.
Absolutely. I know that this is definitely stepping a little bit further into the rabbit hole, but this weekend there's the group that protests every Sunday still on Yankee Valley, and there was a "Don't Tread on Me" flag there, and I was like, that's a southern states thing. Like, what are you doing with that in Canada? But the influence is huge. The same thinking, the same argument, the same things, and even just to put it into our context, when any gun conversations happen on social media, when things have happened in the States, I watch a lot of Canadians on both sides jump in on it, and I go, we are not American. Like, let's address this in our context. And you're a gun owner, I'm a gun owner, and the way I talk about that is in our context. And I think a lot of it's not even thinking anymore; it's just regurgitating arguments on all these political issues. But yeah,
that is something that I just personally have found in the last few years. You know, I guess following a little more American politics and reading a little bit more, it's just how we're not the same as the U.S. But I think I would definitely. Pre-reading that or whatever, would have assumed there was way more similarities. Right. So I think those people holding the signs, or even how it happens in church context, people just assume that we're, the same. Yep. But actually we're not. There's quite a few differences between Canada and the U.S.
But you say you're a gun owner and you're a gun owner. That's a different world, even
entirely.
Getting a gun in Canada and the kinds of gun you can get in Canada.
Yep.
And all of it, like it's a totally different world.
Yep.
than in the States.
Yeah, I'm proud of the restrictions we've got in them. Like when I have that conversation,
Yes.
as somebody who would be, I hope to represent pro-life in all forms. And when this conversation comes up, if guns were a threat to somebody, I'll be the first one to the lineup to give it away if I need to. But that's not our context. Yeah. I will kind of jump back to this last point, though. I appreciate the person recognizing and opposing. I'm assuming, I don't know Morgenthaler. I don't know the
Morgenthaler was one of the fathers of the abortion movement in the States.
Okay.
Maybe you're a little young for this.
I
don't remember the detail. Morgenthaler was one of the main guys, either starting abortion clinics in the States or leading them in the early abortion movement. Morgenthaler became the face, and I don't remember exactly how, the face of the early abortion movement in the States, and was like loathed in the church.
Right. I want to at least give credence, because we've mentioned on this podcast a lot of times the value in being able to have discussion across the aisle, so to speak, that somebody can say, I recognize, even though I disagree, I recognize that. So thanks for sharing that part.
Yeah, I agree.
Cool.
All right, well, let's get to our questions. We did say for the last couple of weeks that we were saving a couple of questions because Doug wanted to be here for them, and we thought it was probably beneficial to have him. There is a bit of a trigger warning here. This is going to deal with sexuality and the abuse of that. So if you don't want to listen, this is your warning.
Yeah.
For everybody else who wants to stay with us, here's the first question. With everything happening with the big church pastors being found guilty of inappropriate behavior or affairs, some with victims who are seeking care, obviously if two adults are consenting, that is one thing compared to if not. But can anyone truly be consenting in such a power dynamic? Example, the situation with Bruxy. Thanks and appreciate this as a difficult one. Disappointing news lately, that's for sure. Mm-hmm. Maybe we should explain the Bruxy situation to give it some context.
Yeah. Well, Bruxy KV, somebody that we've mentioned here lots.
Oh, absolutely. We've referenced him a lot. Big influence on myself. And I can say that for Doug. I don't know if you've been as aware of his stuff as well, Blake. His book, The End of Religion, was huge for me. I loved that book, still do.
Yep. And it was brought forward. At least at first it was one story that he and this woman had an affair lasting a number of years. The meeting house immediately asked him to step back from his position, did a third-party investigation to find all the story was true. Bruxy then resigned from his position. Since then, there have been two more accusations put forth. I'm not sure what the process will be for those. And so, one more, unfortunately, of these stories.
Well, I think it's important to say that what the investigation showed was it was not a consenting affair that took place. He was in his mid-40s. He was counseling someone who was in her young 20s, and this started. And it was not two consenting adults, which is what this question is asking about in any way. It was a power dynamic, and it was an abuse of pastoral authority. So I think it's important to say that Bruxy labeled it as an affair, and that there was some of that terminology used, but this was more than an affair.
Totally. Great clarification. Just looking ahead, should we throw DD in the same conversations?
Well, I think DD is the natural follow-up to this one, so we'll skip CC till after DD. So
should we read it too while we're having the one big conversation then?
Sure.
Okay. Do you want me to read?
Yeah, go
All
for
right.
it.
So then the other question we're going to include in this same conversation is, in any circumstance, is it okay for a pastor to begin a relationship romantically with a member of their church? At what point is the line blurry? Is there a point where the line is blurred? Is it abusive? Is it always abusive?
I don't know that there is an answer to that question. I think that we do have to look at them differently. I guess there's a lot of overlap in these questions. And the first one is, can anyone be consenting in such a power dynamic? I think no. If you're going to see someone in a counseling setting, there's never that doesn't work and it can't work. And that just needs to be said. Like that's a pretty simple, I think. Of all the questions we're going to deal with on this one, that's maybe the easiest one. That's a power dynamic that's not two people in, I would say, in equal roles or in an admitted or perceived equal emotional state.
Yep.
To be able to begin any sort of relationship, because you could have two people who maybe aren't in equal emotional states or maturity level who begin a relationship because they bump into each other on the bus.
Yep.
And that's different. You're going into this. One person is a pastor who's a spiritual leader who's supposed to be there to care for his sheep, and part of the context of caring for the sheep is some counseling, although pastors are not counselors. And I think that needs to be recognized as well. And I think at least part of the problem that we end up with in the church oftentimes is that pastors like to pretend they're counselors when they're not, and they don't know what they're doing sometimes. And that can be as big an issue as anything else. So you have to recognize this relationship starts as the pastor, before this person ever comes to see you for counseling. This relationship starts on an uneven playing field. It starts with a pastor and parishioners. And so there's already a bit of a difference there. Although you could argue, like, the pastor is part of the church, and I think that's where the second question, we'll get into that later. But when you go to this person for counseling, you are opening yourself up emotionally, and you are putting yourself in a place where you're saying, I trust the wisdom of this person, and that there can easily be manipulation and abuse that forms out of that. I think it's Galatians 6:1. You know, if anyone's caught in a sin, and I'm not saying everyone who goes to counseling is in a sin, but I think there's this place that the principle that goes on in that verse applies. If anyone's caught in a sin, you who are spiritual should restore him, but do it carefully, avoiding sin yourself. There's an element of, we should be able to go to people who are further along in their relationship with Jesus and get counsel and get help for them. But there's also a warning for those people that as you help these people, which you are supposed to do, you need to recognize that there's the potential in all sorts of different contexts for sin. And I don't just mean it in this. I remember talking to someone years ago who was in a happily married relationship. And then they started working with someone and talking to someone who is in a very dysfunctional marriage. And then they started seeing all these problems in their marriage. And they came and said to me that I thought I was in a good marriage. And then I started working with this person, and I realized all these problems in my marriage. And I was like, no, let's look at Galatians 6:1. Like, you're letting the sin of this person, you're letting the trappings of this person, what's got this person stuck in the mud, you're letting it get on you. And you just need to be aware of that. You're hearing all the things that they're saying about marriage, and now you're starting to see that. So you got to be able to separate. So that's where that Galatians 6 passage applies to more than just affairs, more than just abuse of pastoral authority. It applies wider, but it also applies in this context. That you have to have that separation. You're there in a certain way representing Jesus. And that is a sacred responsibility that you cannot take lightly.
There's actually, I know in Canada anyways, there's legal, I don't know if precedence is the right word, there's rules about that. Like if someone is in a counseling situation, whether it be a pastoral or just going to a counselor, a secular counselor, if there's abuse that happens there, it is a legal matter.
I knew there was such rules for counselors, specifically psychologists, doctors, all that. I didn't know where it lay. I was going to mention that same thing. It pertains to the
church as well.
Okay, so the minute we step outside the church world, that is what my context I knew was that is immediately taboo and criminal, right? Or can be looked at as such.
So if you're a counselor or a pastor, there's places you could go to date. In your counseling office is not one.
Totally.
Don't be looking to...
But forgive me if I'm wrong, but I was thinking about when Jesus is talking about leading little ones to stumble, and it'd be better that you'd have a stone tied around your neck and thrown into the ocean. Like, Jesus, who commands that, I would argue, a lot of nonviolence and love your enemy and all that, has some pretty harsh words for somebody leading somebody astray. And I would take that not just little ones, like just children, but I think in those power dynamic situations. And so Jesus is pretty clear on that. And again, I do want to acknowledge we are all human, and I can understand the brokenness we've named Bruxy, but in these situations where it happens, that all of us have that in it. I don't want to think I'm better than that in the sense that the same part's not in me, but to watch out and have that stark warning for how clearly we have to be on guard in such situations.
I think it's also just worth saying before you jump in, although we're referencing Bruxy because Bruxy's a big Canadian name,
Yep.
and the latest big Canadian name, and probably the biggest Canadian name.
Yep.
It's not limited to him.
No.
No, and that's
So we're
what
not just
it is.
picking on him.
No.
Yeah, I was going to say, I remember, probably heard from many people this in some sort of variation, but somewhere along the line, I was, warned of this, that, if you bring someone into care who's having marital troubles, or any kind of troubles for that matter, and then a pastoral figure, or in whatever case, someone with authority speaks about how good it should be,
Yeah.
you're immediately put in this hero status where you're like, oh,
Yep.
that guy or that girl, who's ever in the authority really is a good person.
Yeah.
Like, it'd be easy to be attracted to that, especially if you're in a relationship that is not working.
Yep.
This person giving you good advice is going to look much better.
Yep.
So that person in that situation, the advice I was given is be guarded. Like,
Yep.
Give good advice, but don't be putting yourself in a situation where you become that, right?
Yep. Totally.
So,
Yeah.
I was going to comment too along, Doug, you had mentioned the pastors thinking they're counselors. My major was in counseling, and the best thing I got out of that is just realizing how quickly you approach that line of, this is over my head, I'm going to recommend you off to a counselor. They didn't teach us to be counselors in that major. It was basically just saying you are not there without a lot of extra schooling, so be aware of that because it goes unseen a lot of times.
but I think that one too, and now we're getting away from the question where I am, but it's easy for especially young guys, I think, to believe like someone comes to them with a problem
Yep.
and you want to fix it and just think, oh man, I gotta fix this
there's a
problem.
balance where, as a pastor, you do have people who come to you who have issues that you want to help them with.
Totally.
And I always say this: if you're coming to me with a problem that you want me to speak to and offer what I think is Christ-centered biblical wisdom to help you with that, I'm glad to help you with that. I'm glad to offer you some perspective on that.
Yeah.
Where the line is for me is where you're starting to come to me with a lot of deep personal issues
Right.
that's where I'm no longer qualified, I think, to help you.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we want to be able to help people, and we should want to be able to help people. But part of knowing where to help people is knowing where I can't help you. But at the same time, I've had lots of people in 27 years of ministry who've come and said, can I get some counseling?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I'll always sit down with them. Yeah. And there's been numerous times where shortly into the conversation, I go, this is way over my head.
Totally.
But a lot of times, and most of the time, when people come with counseling, it's not because they're wrestling with some necessarily deep personal, and I mean, every issue is a personal issue, an internal, interior person issue.
Yeah.
And even some of those we might be able to help them with. Like if somebody's coming and they're struggling with identity, we can help point them to what does the Bible say about your identity.
Yep.
Yeah.
But when you get into some deep of those issues, that's where you go, whoa, okay, I can't help here. But if you've got, I got this situation and I don't know what to do with this situation,
Yep.
we're happy to help. We don't want to say we're not willing to help.
Yep.
We're happy to help. But we recognize we have our limitations.
And our role can be in conjunction with other things as well, too, right? There have been times I've encouraged somebody over to a counselor while I walk with them as well, and just know those boundaries.
Absolutely. Yeah. But I think we're way off
Yes, we
of
are.
where this question is.
Yeah.
That I look at and go, I would agree with what I think is the implication of this question, that no one going to a pastor for counseling is in any way in a position to be in a consenting relationship.
Yeah.
I'd agree.
And I assume there's some kind of, not statute of limitations, that's not the right word, but some kind of expiry on that too. Like it wouldn't just be hey, well, since we walked you through that, now 6 months later, hey.
Our counseling session is over.
Right.
You want to go for coffee?
The same way there would be for other professions, I'm sure, like it'd probably be a number of years between such a relationship or dynamic there before anything was different. I'm just guessing, throwing that out there.
So is that answered well enough? Can we move on to the other question then? In any circumstances, is it okay for a pastor to begin a relationship romantically with a member of their church? This is different. Now they're not coming for counseling. They're just in your church.
Yeah.
I would say, yeah, there are circumstances where it's okay for the pastor to begin a romantic relationship. with someone in their church? Absolutely. The first one would be they shouldn't be married to someone.
Neither party.
But
Yeah.
the pastor specifically shouldn't be. Like the question is,
Yeah.
should a pastor begin a romantic relationship?
Yeah.
Because the previous question talked about two adults are consenting is one thing.
Yeah.
And so I think that it's worth saying
Yep. Totally.
that if the pastor's looking to begin a romantic relationship,
Yep.
they shouldn't be married.
Totally.
That would be a pretty good starting point, I would say.
All right.
So,
No debate there.
but having said that, and we've talked about this a
Yeah.
little bit, I think that it could be okay. I do. I think that your church, hopefully for everyone, and this should include the pastors, your church should be your community. It should be the people that you do life with.
Yep.
That's what it's meant to be. And if you were a single person who was pastoring in a church and there was another single person who was pastoring in a church and something, or maybe they weren't pastoring a church, but they were just in the church and something began there, I think you would have to handle it well and exercise a lot of wisdom and move slowly. But I don't think you could give a hard and fast no to that.
Yep. And I did start on a hard and fast no when we first saw this question. Like,
Yes, you
no
did.
way. There's no chance. And most of what was in my head, just from the stage of life I've been in the last number of years, is having friends who are young and just starting out in ministry and trying to date, and especially looking back to right when I got out of Bible college, watching friends who did that and not having the wisdom and maturity of life experience, and that going messy and sideways, and then you just have a line of people who have left your church because you dated them and broke up with them, and you can't leave because you're the pastor. Like, those were interesting. Those were what was first on my mind. And then even just if it did go well, like just the level of accountability was really important in my head, that it's such a delicate balance to make sure there isn't any of that power dynamic at play there.
Yep.
Like I can remember, this is going even further back, but I remember when I was in youth group, even on the older end of youth group, every girl thinking they wanted to marry a youth pastor because, like, wow, back to that dynamic of that's a great man right there when I'm struggling with my marriage. And look at that. With that said, as we got talking, and I think I was chatting with Keelan actually about it, I think there's a power dynamic to some degree in every relationship, or at least a majority of them, where something attracts you to that person versus the rest of the crowd because you go, hey, they're awesome. So I'm willing to admit there's going to always be some kind of play in power dynamic there. But with that, I think the encouragement I would have, the circumstances I would encourage, would be to the utmost accountability, whether that be a board, if you were an associate on staff of some kind, to make sure your senior pastor was involved. And
Again, though, I think you're funneling this into a young person thing, and I'm looking at it in a different context because I'm aware of someone who was a pastor whose wife had passed away. I'm actually aware of two people who were pastors whose wives passed away, who ended up remarrying someone in their church. Who in their 40s they went through this heartache of a spouse dying. And then from someone in their church, they ended up remarrying and having another wife. Yeah. So I think that it just seems to me you're still looking at it through the lens of younger. Yeah. And maybe it's because of age. I'm looking at it and experience. I'm looking at the answer. I know of two people in their 40s who've done that. Right. And I know of one guy who years ago when he was a youth pastor married a girl in his youth group. Yeah. So I'm aware of more people who ended up in their 40s marrying someone in their church than someone when they were younger.
Well, the minute I saw the nuance in the conversation from where my hard line at first, I just immediately began trying to apply it in my own head to myself. Like if my wife and kids were off on vacation and they were visiting family and they didn't make the plane didn't make it back, what would it look like in my life? And that was the standard I was immediately trying to come up with myself. Like I would let or probably you more than the board, just the way our dynamic works here. And then I'd let you know before that even began, and I'd keep you accountable all the way through. Like that's the standard I was trying to set to myself, was what was in my head. But maybe I do land on that younger end, but I just go, because of this, and especially because of the numerous stories in the church of this happening, back to even our conversation earlier of the church almost needs to do what it's supposed to do just to get back to net zero, I think because of the reputation in churches right now to the public, I'd want to be that much more careful if it was me even. That's where I'm putting it.
I think, though, that I think you can't mix the two. I don't think that that's okay, what you're doing there. Because you're saying because of what happened with Bruxy, you know, somebody whose wife passes away, who begins a relationship, he needs to think about what the world looks at.
Sure.
I don't think anybody in the world would look at that guy who started dating someone, whether it was in his church or in a church down the road, and begrudge them, because they're two completely different things.
Yep.
And I'm not saying we shouldn't have, you know, accountability and intentionality and wisdom practiced at all times. I don't think they're the same thing. If you saw a widow, and I've worked with and walked with guys who've had their wives pass away, and women who've had their husbands pass away, and then remarried. Yep. Nobody begrudges them. It's that they're not. Nobody's looking at them going, well, that's very similar to Bruxy Cavey. Yeah. Like, that just does not happen because they're completely different worlds.
Yeah. And I don't know. I'm thinking as you guys are discussing this, like, there's got to be tons of stories of young pastors going to pastor churches, even as a solo pastor, and getting married off in those churches. Like, I would think that was just a regular thing. I would think if a young pastor, doesn't have to be youth, showed up in this church and got a role and they were single, there would be people in this church who would be like, all right, so who are we hooking you up with, right? Like, I think that's just naturally going to happen. So I wonder statistically how often that has worked really well and how often it has been a bad situation. I would assume that it's probably worked well more often.
Right. And then maybe, again, it's generational, where I'm thinking and I hear these stories and the narrative of these power dynamics so often just amongst millennials and Gen Zs, that this is a regular conversation, awareness of these power dynamics and stuff like that, that maybe it's just further on the front of my mind in regards to that, maybe an overcorrection. But that's what I think. Even though I do admit it's an apples to oranges comparison, I think any level of ability to compare the two, I would want to be extra cautious, not to set X amount of parameters, just make sure you're doing your due diligence to be as accountable as you can.
Yeah, I think that's wise.
I would hope that anybody who is of any level of spiritual maturity would do that in any way. But even more so when it's a pastor, absolutely. But I guess I look at this question, and I can appreciate the heart behind it, and I can appreciate our conversation behind it. But I have one person who I would consider a friend, who went through this, and ended up marrying somebody in his church. And I look at him and I go, he was in his 40s. His wife passed away of cancer. Right. And then all of a sudden he was single. Right. And you know, he took some time, he grieved, he mourned, he did all of that.
Of course.
I don't think anybody could or would begrudge that guy. Yeah. From all of a sudden there was somebody who came along, and then they started dating, and things happened, and it became a celebration for the whole church. Totally. And the continuation of the story of the church, of the pastor, of the people. Like, it was totally done well, and it was all that. And so I want to make sure we understand that there's very different scenarios.
For sure. At play there.
The problem with any rule is that rules are useless, right?
Oh, yeah.
You're a rule follower. I am not. I'm not someone who just blindly follows rules. My wife is a rule follower, and we were talking about this last night. Like, because I'm like, rules only stop the people who were going to obey them anyway.
Yes.
So this is true. This is the problem with all rules, right? Yes. Like, you could say, well, then no pastor should ever date anyone in their church. Yeah. And all that would do is, if a pastor had his wife die, he couldn't date a single woman in his church, or a single man, because it could be a female pastor. You'd stop that person from dating. But the pastor who's counseling, who's preying on someone in a power dynamic, is not going to go, wait a minute, I can't do this now because I'm not allowed to date.
Totally.
This is the problem with rules.
I completely agree there. Yeah, I completely agree. And I think
Is that
that's
how easy it is? Like, should we just be making?
oh man.
If we had these rules, it would have just helped everybody.
I believe that the Old Testament and the New Testament kind of give us an idea about how effective rules
This
are.
is
And
true.
it's funny how the church
Yeah.
is always wanting to put more rules in place.
Yeah.
When if we look at the Bible and what it actually says about the effectiveness of law,
Puts
we
us
would-
more into sin.
we would go, you know what? Maybe we shouldn't spend all our time trying to put some law in place.
But Doug, we can wash our hands of the situation because we said we had the rules in place, and then we're
That's
good.
the problem.
Yep.
That is definitely the problem, Kyle. Yeah.
So it's just a funny thing. Like,
Yeah.
and I understand where the question's coming from, and I think it's a natural response to the scandals that we've seen, and we've seen way too many of them.
Yep.
But I just go, the problem with all rules, because we want to put rules in place,
Yep.
and the problem with rules is
Yeah.
they do nothing.
Yep.
Right? If
Totally.
never mind, I'll stop.
And that's where I recognize the nuance of it. And so encouraging wisdom and accountability versus here's the rule, don't cross the line, I think is the way to go.
Yep.
Yeah.
We should get into this next one if we're...
All right, this next
have
one,
time.
we're talking about situations being different. Here's another different situation, but kind of along the same lines to some degree. So this
I
question,
feel like this one's a completely different...
it's
Only
still
in that it deals with church
sexuality and
leadership. Yeah, but
Dating
I don't.
in the
What I
church.
guess what I don't want to do once people hear this question is think that we're somehow connecting this
Correct.
question to the Bruxy.
No.
Yeah.
We are not
Totally.
doing that in any way.
Yep.
So that's where I want to just make sure that people understand that.
Yep.
All right, perfect. All right, so this starts off by saying, providing some backstory prior to my question. I'm a married man in my 30s and have 2 children. I'm also straight, so I feel a bit out of my depth asking this one, but was interested. Hope this is truly anonymous. Now, LOL.
And yes,
It
yes,
is.
it is. If they submitted it through the website, it
We have
is.
no clue.
We do not know who you are.
Yeah.
A family member of mine recently came out as a member of the LGBTQ community. It's something we are wrestling with as we grow to accept and support this journey. This is especially a confusing time, though, as he is a pastor in a different province. He's been asked to step down because he's in love with his partner and because he isn't in a straight presenting relationship. This brings me to my question. If we can't rely on even our heterosexual spiritual leaders to be monogamous or to not engage in inappropriate relationships, then why is it wrong for a pastor who is gay and in a loving relationship to be leading the church? I can't seem to reconcile this. Couldn't a gay loving relationship teach us to be more like Jesus, even if it is something we are learning to accept? It saddens me that he's essentially being asked to end his relationship and stay hiding his truth to keep his job.
I can so appreciate the tension that you are feeling
Yep.
in this question. I just want to begin by saying that I hear the heart behind the question, and it saddens me as well.
Yep.
So
All the tensions that you're feeling, I totally get them. Of somebody who you love and care for and have seen, I'm sure, the great work they've done in their ministry to be able to say, can't this person be a part of, like, somebody that sounds like you look up to yourself, to say, I want them to be able to lead and help the church, and to not see them be able to do that. I completely get that.
I guess I'd begin by, if that last statement is true, and I'm not saying that it's not, I'm not doubting the validity of it. It saddens me that he's essentially being asked to end his relationship and stay hiding his truth to keep his job. I think the church is handling that wrong. I don't think that's where you draw the line. Like, wherever this church needs to wrestle through this issue, and we have talked a lot on this podcast about LGBT, I would say more LGB issues than T issues. If we're being honest, we haven't addressed T a lot, and there is a world of difference between lesbian, gay, bi, and transgender. They're not. They kind of got, my understanding, they kind of got together as a bunch of people who are on the outskirts of society and who were persecuted and kind of banded together as a group. But there is also a lot of difference between the two.
Very much so.
So this is an LGB issue more so than a T issue. And we have talked about the LGB theology numerous times on this podcast. We've talked about our wrestling with it. We've talked about some of the reading and the research we've done.
Yeah.
We've talked about all of these things. Just that last sentence bothers me. It saddens me that they're saying, if you want to live an inauthentic life, you can keep your job.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know what to do with it. I'm just saying, and maybe it's because we've been wrestling with this for a longer time, that just my perspective on this has shifted and changed over a lot of time.
Yeah.
I don't know what the answer is. I feel your pain, and I am sorry.
Did you want to jump in there?
No, go ahead.
At the risk of sounding a little bit impersonal, and I want to give some credence to two sides here, but first I think from an argumentation standpoint, if A is failing, can we not allow B? It seems to be the argument being presented in this question. If our straight pastors aren't doing their job to remain so and remain monogamous, then can't we let the LGBTQ community be pastors as well? Is how I see the argument laid out. And I just don't think from an argument standpoint that necessarily holds up. And I don't think that's where the debate really comes in. I want to give some credence to some churches that will land in a non-affirming spot, and I know of a lot of them who do that gently and humbly and passionately and carefully and in mourning of like, this is just where we feel conviction that we can't go there. This is just not where we're at. That then holding to what they believe to be true and to believe to be the boundary are doing that, and I think they could be asking of this in a very loving way. I think they could do that. Okay. I don't know the situation. On the other hand, coming from a place where we've landed of accommodating and being able to kind of see the nuance in the conversation and not landing on either side necessarily is I guess where I would sum up where we've landed. I do in part personally envy, I'll genuinely use that word, some of our brothers and sisters who have come to an entirely affirming spot where when they've wrestled with Scripture, when they felt the conviction of the Spirit towards this, they've come to a place where they can affirm somebody in that role and go, awesome, we can put you in a leadership position. I've joked I'm kind of like 51% non-affirming is about where I've landed. I'm just on one side of the argument personally. And so I can see both sides going, if that church has landed there, but I can't expect that community to have rushed through this process. And so maybe this is the first time that they're being forced to have the conversation and are maybe not laying it out proper and well quickly, or maybe they'll grow in time. We've had that time to be able to walk this conversation out. So I look at the human part for them and go, I really hope they're able to navigate this well, and I can empathize where they're at, trying to honor what they see Scripture to say. And on the other hand, I can go, I think there are churches who have landed in the place where they can completely affirm and put somebody in that spot. And I hope this person, your brother, can land in a spot where they are welcome. And it's this really difficult, messy tension to say, I see both sides could be Christ-honoring simultaneously, which is a really weird spot to be.
You're right. I want to just back up the bus. I don't want to say you're right. This has been a long journey for me, and I don't know that I've always would have been. Well, I know I wouldn't always been where I am now, but I guess for me, where I've come to and where I'm at now is I wouldn't want. I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't have been so judgmental up front.
Well, I hear that.
No, I'm agreeing with you. Yeah. You're right. You're absolutely right. I guess for me, where I've come to, where I'm at today.
Yep.
This is all I can speak of, and it's been a long journey for 2 years plus of wrestling with this and other issues. Somehow, I would want to try to encourage people to all be able to be authentic.
Yep.
Even if that means saying you can't work here, we'll bless you, go. Yep. I wouldn't want to say, I wouldn't want to put somebody in a position where there'd be a temptation to think I could live an insincere life.
Correct.
To keep my career.
Yep.
That's the part that for me, where I'm just like, I don't think that's sustainable. I don't think that works in the long term.
Yep. And
I think you're just kicking a problem down the road.
Yep.
That's where for me there's a tension. Because I don't think that it works well ever.
Yep.
So I feel like we're missing the whole at least I'm speaking to that, and that's not even the question. The question is more about, he's not in a straight presenting relationship, which to me, I'm like, but again, that bothers me, because what if he was single? Like in this context, he is in another relationship. So what if he was single? Can he not be on staff because he's then not in a state presenting relationship?
And different churches land different spots. Like I know the Presbyterian Church of America last year or the year before went into a big vote. Can they have somebody who is remaining abstinent, who is openly gay, be in their leadership? I can't remember where they ultimately landed, so don't quote me on it. But I look at their situation and I go, I appreciate that they're wrestling with the question, and I can understand theologically how they get there and go, okay, we can understand that you're there and being gay is not a sin, but looking at scripture where they land, we've decided that you can't be in a relationship. And so I think the two parties in agreement, this is where it gets really difficult, where the church can only grow, that local community specifically can only grow at the pace that they can grow. And so the leader that is leading them, they have to be able to hear and receive from them, right? So if I don't know what kind of example to make up, but there's going to be only so far your leader can bring you. And so I think I can see all three situations being good in Christ-like as long as we are moving towards that. And so you can say we're non-affirming, we can't have somebody who's openly gay in our congregation as our leader, as long as you're able to do that in a gracious manner and work towards Christ-likeness and how you do that. You can do that in a really poor way. I know people who have been in affirming churches who they just have anybody there and they're happy to have anybody of the LGBTQ community as their pastor because they're proud that that's where they've landed theologically, and yet not looking at some of those character dynamics either. And so that person can't lead them any better. I remember there was a debate in the Anglican Church a number of years ago for the first person who had applied to be a credential holder who was an atheist. Right? And it's like, well, we're just so open that we can have this conversation. Well, why don't we have an atheist leader in congregation? Well, whoa. Maybe if that church was at a place where, well, I don't know any church that could be there. But I'm just going, I can see the difficulty for the leader to be able to carry people. And if the people aren't ready for that, you can't expect them to be able to receive from a leader where they haven't grown yet. And so I'm thankful for this church where we've been able to have this conversation of accommodating stance, and our people hear us from where we're at. And I look at this congregation, and I hope that they can at least be Christ-like in their posture while they are doing this difficultly, though I hear the pain that you're feeling watching your brother go through this.
It doesn't say brother, just so you know. It's just his family member.
Oh.
So it could be a cousin or a nephew or something.
Oh, I could have sworn I read brother. But
no, it just says a family member, and it's a guy.
Right.
I'm just saying it could be extended family.
Yeah.
I appreciate, Kyle, you saying, I think, Doug, you kind of used language too. I appreciate the humility and trying to follow Christ, like, just being surrendered to that. Because I think that is the thing that we have held in tension, and I think I love about where we are as a church right now, is we've gone, this is messy, this is hard. How do we continue to try and honor Christ and work our way through this, right? Yep. Because I think all of us, anybody who's been in a church for any length of time, understands we're humans. And we're going to have personal opinion. We're going to have personal preference. We're going to have lots of tradition. We're going to have lots of reasons why we wouldn't want whatever it is that we're talking about, right? Yep. And then that becomes where we land, rather than being humble and going, okay, how is God working through this? How can we help others work through this? That would be my heart as I read this question, and I think of our own church, and then I think of other congregations. I think, I hope that we as Christians, again, going back to our identity and what people know us for, is that we are humbly seeking God. Yeah. We're just not jumping to things that are our own personal opinion or preference or whatever. It's like, how is God working in this situation, and how do we follow him? Yeah. And being able to understand we're going to fail lots in that posture. Yeah. But at least we're moving in that direction. Yeah.
In answer to this person's question, though, because they are asking a question that I don't know that we've even got to.
Right.
If we can't rely on heterosexual spiritual leaders to be a monogamous, why not engage in inappropriate relationships? Why is it wrong for a pastor who's gay and in a loving relationship to be leading the church? And I think that, how do I say this well? think there's a validity to your question as a person in the church, because church leadership has failed so often.
Yeah.
I think that's a reasonable question. I think that it does speak to the fact that the church and the heterosexual spiritual leaders in the church have by and large sucked a lot.
Yep.
And that I don't know the answer to your question, but I again go, it saddens me that you can't rely on your spiritual leaders.
Yep.
And that is the problem. The problem is that the heterosexual spiritual leaders in churches have failed so much that this is a legitimate question. Whatever your position on LGB, I'm not going to say T, whatever your position on LGB, wherever you land, no matter what. Now, I guess if you're affirming, then it's a non-issue. But if you're not in an affirming camp, it saddens me that you have seen this. The hypocrisy that has often been in the church, that has been on full display, oftentimes most loudly through church leadership, makes this a very legitimate question. I don't know what the answer to it is, but I want to say this is a very legitimate question.
Yeah. I guess I was thinking more of the context of the church that wouldn't be affirming yet, where I go, for them, that is a little bit of a apples and oranges comparison. For the church that hasn't landed in an affirming spot theologically, where they go, well, we can't go there.
I understand, but I'm saying if the church is in an affirming spot, then this is a non-question.
Well, I'll make it a different subject then. For the church that is egalitarian versus complementarian. So the church that will ordain women and won't ordain women. For them to see male pastor after male pastor after male pastor fail, according to their theological convictions that I hope they've come to gracefully, they will never look at having a woman step in as the lead pastor if they had 10 males in a row fail for moral failure, because they're holding to the conviction that that is not how God has led them to be. And so I go,
but I think that in that situation, if you have the egalitarian and the complementarian church, and the complementarian church is seeing male pastor after male pastor fail, and somewhere in town there's a church with a female pastor that's just rocking it. At some point, someone in that church is going to go, why can't we try a female pastor?
I totally agree. And that was how John Wesley...
That's going to happen.
Yeah, that's how John Wesley changed himself. He was theologically complementarian and watched woman after woman after woman and baptized in the Holy Spirit, speaking in prophecy and teaching incredibly. And it was the fruit of those people that he was changed before his theology had even changed. And went, well, it's back to Acts 15 that we've mentioned before. Seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us. Well, since the Holy Spirit's already laying the prophetic gift and the teaching gift on these women, then I think it's a really good thing. And so I think, because unfortunately, and I say this a little bit half-heartedly, unfortunately, God works slowly in our time and in our culture. I think those places that can and theologically are open to elevating LGBTQ voices, I think have a responsibility to do so that those that aren't there yet can see the fruit of such people going, hey, okay, I watched that pastor there who I wouldn't have agreed with theologically doing some awesome stuff, and I can affirm that even though if I'm not there yet theologically.
The only thing, part of that sentence I would have issue with is you making it God's fault that he moves slowly.
No.
It's not God's fault that he moves slowly.
He works with humans, and therefore it's a slow work.
I think it's the sheep.
That is the problem.
Yes,
the problem
absolutely.
is the followers, not the one leading.
Because he has decided to work with people, and we are dumb, and I know because I'm people, as I've joked before, then yes, there is this slow trickle to growth. And so I hope those churches that are able to can elevate some of those voices and to see that. And those that aren't can be watching and humble enough to receive, oh, wait, okay, there is something happening that I may have disagreed with out the bat.
Yeah, I appreciate this person's wrestling. I want to also just say to whoever submitted this question, and it is anonymous, as a pastor, I am sorry that you have seen so many spiritual leaders fail. That this is a legitimate question. Wherever you land on the LGB, and again, I'm holding T off because of the context of this question. Wherever you land on being affirming or not, this question seems to be birthed out of seeing leaders fail at least as much of your theological wrestling you're going through right now.
Yep.
And so I am sorry for the part that spiritual leaders have played in making this a legitimate question.
Yep. Yeah.
Right on. Well, I think we answered those questions today, and they were maybe difficult ones, but good for us to wrestle with these things. And hopefully we as spiritual leaders can do our best to stay humble and do what God has asked us to do. In the meantime, we will see you guys next week. Keep your questions coming.
Yeah.
We got a few for next week, but we always like to see them. So keep them coming. If you have any AERs, you can send them in as well, and we will get to them next week. See you guys.
See ya.
This has been the Living Springs Q&A podcast. If you have a question you would like answered or would like to learn more, visit us at livingspringsairdrie.com. Thanks for tuning in.